The armored Escalade moved through the rain-slicked streets like a black ghost, its tinted windows reflecting nothing but the city's neon indifference. Inside, the silence was absolute, the kind of quiet that came not from peace, but from power so complete it didn't need to announce itself. Viktor Russo sat in the back, one hand resting on the leather seat, the other checking his phone with the precision of a man who controlled every minute of his day. Steel blue eyes scanned messages that moved millions, decided fates, settled debts. The world outside was chaos. The world inside his vehicle was order, cold and calculated. He had built an empire on leverage and fear, on knowing exactly when to apply pressure and when to break. At 52, his face carried the map of every hard decision, the scar beneath his cheekbone, a reminder that mercy was a luxury he'd abandoned long ago. Silver streaked through his dark hair like frost on iron, and his charcoal overcoat hung on his broad shoulders with the weight of a crown. Beside him, small and impossibly fragile in this world of steel and shadow, sat his daughter. Elena was 7 years old, clutching a tiny white stuffed rabbit against her pastel pink sweater dress. Her light brown braid had come slightly loose, and she watched the rain trace patterns on the window with the kind of wonder that Viktor had forgotten existed. She was the single soft thing in his hardened universe, the only person who could make him remember what it felt like to be human. The driver navigated toward their estate on the city's edge, away from the concrete and corruption, toward the manicured safety Viktor had purchased for his little girl. Everything was going according to plan. Everything was under control. And then, cutting through the engine's low purr and the rain's steady rhythm, came a sound that didn't belong. A high, desperate whining, broken and afraid. Elena's small hand pressed against the window, her hazel eyes suddenly wide. "Daddy." Her voice was barely a whisper, trembling with something Viktor recognized but hadn't felt in years, pure, unguarded compassion. "Why is that dog crying?" Viktor froze. The question hung in the air like smoke, and for the first time in decades, the man who controlled an empire felt something inside him shift. He looked where his daughter was pointing, past the rain-streaked glass, toward the roadside where the city's carefully maintained facade gave way to forgotten corners. What he saw next would break the one rule he'd lived by: never get involved unless there was something to gain. There, beneath a broken streetlight, a rusted sedan sat dead on the gravel shoulder, its hood up and steam rising into the cold air. And beside it, 2 young girls, no older than 19, were crouched in the rain. One had strawberry blonde hair plastered to her face, her cream hoodie soaked through as she clutched something against her chest. The other stood over her, an oversized denim jacket doing nothing against the downpour, her stance protective and defiant even in the face of the storm. Between them, wrapped in what looked like a torn blanket, was a dog, a medium-sized mutt with matted fur and a leg bent at an angle that made Viktor's jaw tighten even from this distance. The animal's cries were raw, primal, the kind of sound that spoke of pain beyond words. And standing a few feet away, arms crossed and face twisted with something between annoyance and cruelty, was a third woman, older, maybe late 40s, in a simple beige cardigan that clung to her thin frame. She was saying something to the girls, gesturing at the broken car, at the dog, her expression exhausted but desperate, like someone fighting a battle they'd already lost. "Sir," the driver's voice broke through. "Should I stop the car?" The words came out before Viktor could think them through. Before calculation could override instinct. Before the cold logic that had kept him alive could remind him that stopping meant involvement, and involvement meant weakness. But Elena was already unbuckling her seatbelt, her small face pressed against the window, and in her eyes Viktor saw something he thought he'd buried with his own childhood, the belief that the world could still be saved, one small act at a time. The Escalade's engine went silent, and Viktor Russo, the man who had built his empire on knowing exactly when to walk away, opened the door and stepped into the rain. The rain hit Viktor's shoulders like a judgment, cold and unrelenting, but he barely noticed. His polished shoes sank into the gravel as he moved toward the broken sedan, Elena's small hand already slipping into his a lifeline he hadn't known he needed. Up close, the scene was worse than he'd imagined. The dog's whimpering had softened to shallow, ragged breaths, and the girl holding it, Lily, he would learn had tears streaming down her freckled face, mixing with the rain until there was no difference between grief and storm. Her cream hoodie was stained with mud and blood, and her hands trembled as she pressed the torn blanket tighter around the animal's broken body. "Please," she whispered, "not to Viktor but to the universe. Please don't die." The other girl, Lucy, stood like a guardian, her green eyes blazing with the kind of fury that came from watching helplessness repeat itself too many times. She saw Viktor approach and immediately stepped forward, her denim jacket hanging heavy with water, her jaw set. "We don't need your pity, we need a miracle." Behind them, the older woman Margaret put a hand on Lucy's shoulder, gently pulling her back. Her tired blue eyes met Viktor's, and in them he saw a recognition that chilled him more than the rain. She knew what he was, knew the kind of power that moved in tailored suits and armored vehicles, and she was terrified of what that meant. "Our car died," Margaret said quietly, her voice hoarse. "We were trying to get to the emergency vet across town. This dog," her voice cracked. "We run a small rescue, just the three of us. She was dumped on our property this morning, her leg already broken. We've been driving for 20 minutes trying to find help. And then, she didn't finish. She didn't have to." Elena knelt beside Lily without hesitation, her small hand reaching out to touch the dog's matted fur. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice so pure it made something in Viktor's chest constrict. "My daddy can fix anything." The weight of that faith settled on Viktor like chains. "How much do you need?" His voice came out rougher than intended, but Margaret shook her head, and there was something broken in the gesture. "It's not just about money, even if we save her tonight." She looked back at the dead car, at the rain pooling in the open hood. "We're 3 months behind on our property taxes. The man who holds our loan, he's been waiting for us to fail, waiting to take the land, turn it into condos or storage units. He doesn't care that we've saved 43 dogs in 2 years. He doesn't care that this is all we have." Lucy's hands curled into fists. "Dominic Crane. He's a vulture. Charges triple the normal rate, and every time we're late, he adds more fees, more threats. Last week he said if we miss one more payment, he's taking everything." Viktor knew the name. Dominic Crane, a small-time loan shark who played at being legitimate, preying on people too desperate or too kind to fight back. The kind of man Viktor would have crushed without thought in any other context. But this wasn't business. This was his daughter, kneeling in the rain, looking up at him like he was still capable of being a hero. "Get in the car," Viktor said. The veterinary clinic's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across Viktor's face as he stood by the window, watching Elena kneel beside the examination table. The dog, a mutt named Jasper, he'd learned, lay sedated, his broken leg now wrapped and stabilized. The vet had been efficient, asking no questions when Viktor handed him enough cash to cover a month's worth of emergencies. But money couldn't erase the fear he'd seen in Margaret Carter's eyes, or the way her daughters had flinched when she'd mentioned a name, Donovan Greaves. Elena looked up at him, her small hand still resting on Jasper's side. "He'll be okay now, right, Daddy?" Viktor knelt beside her, his expensive suit creasing against the sterile floor. "Yes, Angel. I promise." The words tasted foreign on his tongue. Promises made to children were dangerous things. But as he looked into those trusting hazel eyes, he knew this wasn't just about a dog anymore. It was about the kind of man his daughter would remember him as. By midnight, Viktor knew everything. His men worked quickly, efficiently, pulling records that most people didn't know existed. Donovan Greaves was exactly what Viktor expected, a small-time predator who'd grown fat on the misery of those too weak to fight back. He owned half the rental properties in the area, all of them falling apart while he collected inflated rents and threatened eviction at the first missed payment. The Carter family owed him 18 months of back rent. Their small rescue operation saving strays like Jasper from the streets had drained what little money they had. Greaves had given them until the end of the week to pay $32,000, or he'd take their home and have every animal put down. Viktor's jaw tightened as he read the reports. Greaves had done this before. 12 families evicted in the past 2 years. 3 small businesses shuttered. All legal, technically. All monstrous. He made a single phone call. The meeting happened in a place Viktor chose, a storage warehouse on the edge of the industrial district, empty except for 2 chairs and the echo of water dripping from rusted pipes. Greaves arrived with 2 men, confidence in his swagger until he saw who was waiting. Viktor didn't stand. He simply watched as Greaves' face went from cocky to cautious to pale. "Mr. Russo, I didn't know." "Sit." The word carried enough weight to drop Greaves into the chair like his legs had been cut. His bodyguard stayed by the door, smart enough to recognize when they were outmatched. Viktor leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "The Carter family. You're going to forgive their debt tonight. That's $32,000. You're also going to transfer the deed to their property into Margaret Carter's name. Free and clear." Greaves' mouth opened, closed. "You can't just—" Viktor's hand moved, placing a single photograph on the table between them. Greaves in a parking lot, envelope exchanging hands with a city inspector. The man's face went white. "I have 14 more like this," Viktor said. His tone conversational, almost pleasant. "Building code violations you paid to ignore, bribes to push through evictions. That fire last year in the North Side apartments, the one you claimed was faulty wiring?" He tilted his head. "We both know it wasn't." The silence stretched, broken only by Greaves' ragged breathing. "Here's what happens now," Viktor continued, standing slowly. "By morning, the Carter family will own their home. The debt disappears. Your interest in their lives ends completely." He buttoned his coat with deliberate precision. "Or these photos find their way to the district attorney, the fire marshal, and every news outlet in the city. Your choice." Greaves was shaking now. "This is justice," Viktor finished. "Something you've avoided for too long." He walked toward the door, then paused. "And Greaves, if I hear you've retaliated in any way, if any harm comes to that family or their animals, what I've shown you tonight will feel like mercy compared to what comes next." By dawn, Viktor's lawyer called to confirm it. The debt was erased, the deed transferred, and Donovan Greaves had quietly listed his rental properties for sale before leaving the city. Viktor stood in his study, watching the sun rise over the estate, and for the first time in years, he felt something that had nothing to do with power or fear. He felt clean. 3 days later, Viktor's Escalade returned to a place he never thought he'd see again, a small veterinary clinic on the edge of the city, where miracles happened in rooms that smelled of antiseptic and hope. The dog had survived. Against odds that would have broken lesser creatures, the mutt had clawed its way back from the edge, its leg now splinted and wrapped, its eyes clear for the first time in what must have been months. The vet had called it remarkable. Viktor called it stubborn. Elena called it beautiful. She was already inside when Viktor entered, her small hand resting gently on the dog's head as it lay on a cushioned table, tail thumping weakly against the padding. The Carter twins flanked her Lily with tears streaming down her freckled face, Lucy with an arm around her sister's shoulders and something like wonder in her green eyes. Margaret Carter stood near the doorway, her thin frame wrapped in a coat that looked newer than anything Viktor had seen her wear before. The debt was gone. The landlord had vanished, not violently, but absolutely, the way problems disappeared when Viktor Russo decided they should. The family's small rescue shelter was safe. Their home was theirs again. But the gratitude in Margaret's eyes made Viktor more uncomfortable than any threat ever had. "Mr. Russo," she began, her voice fragile as glass. We can't possibly." She stopped, pressing a hand to her mouth. "Thank you doesn't seem—" "It's enough," Viktor said quietly, surprised by the gentleness in his own voice. "You don't owe me anything." Lily looked up then, her blue eyes red-rimmed but shining. "He's going to be okay," the doctor said. "He's going to walk again." Her voice broke on the last word, and she buried her face in the dog's fur. Elena turned to her father, and Viktor saw his entire world reflected in her hazel eyes. Not the empire he'd built, not the power he'd accumulated, but something infinitely more valuable. Pride. Pure, uncomplicated pride in him. "Daddy did this," she whispered to the dog, scratching behind its ears. "My daddy saved you." The words hit harder than any bullet Viktor had ever dodged. He'd been called many things: boss, monster, king of shadows. But standing in that small clinic, watching his daughter embrace an injured mutt with the same love she'd give a prince, he realized the only title that had ever mattered was the one she'd just given him: father. Not of an empire, but of a girl who still believed the world could be saved. Lucy stepped forward then, extending her hand. It was covered in dog hair and still trembling slightly, but her grip was firm. "You didn't have to help us," she said simply. "But you did." Viktor took her hand, and for the first time in 30 years, he felt something other than the cold weight of power in his chest. It was warm, unfamiliar, dangerous in its vulnerability. Margaret moved closer, placing a gentle hand on Elena's shoulder. "Your daughter," she said softly to Viktor, "has the kindest heart I've ever seen, I think. I think maybe she got that from somewhere." Viktor's throat tightened. He'd spent decades convinced that kindness was weakness, that compassion was currency for fools. But watching Elena laugh as the dog licked her face, seeing the Carter family whole again because he'd chosen mercy over muscle, maybe his daughter hadn't inherited his darkness after all. Maybe, just maybe, he'd inherited her light. The afternoon sun cut through the clinic windows, painting everything gold: the healing dog, the grateful family, the little girl in the pink sweater dress who'd stopped a crime boss with a single question. Viktor leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he smiled. Not the cold smile of a predator, the warm smile of a man who'd found his way home. Let's make compassion go viral. Like, share, and subscribe if you believe kindness still matters now more than ever.